Introduction. Some books were never just books. They carried ideas so powerful, so unsettling, that entire governments tried to silence them. Tonight, we'll uncover the hidden history of forbidden knowledge, the stories of works that were banned, censored, and buried, yet never forgotten. The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. In 1988, a novel emerged that would ignite one of the most intense controversies in modern literary history. The Satanic Verses, written by Salman Rushdie, was published in the United Kingdom and almost immediately drew worldwide attention. On the surface, it was a work of magical realism, blending myth, history, and fiction. Yet within its pages, some found what they considered a direct challenge to deeply rooted religious beliefs. The reaction that followed went far beyond literary criticism and entered the realm of politics, censorship, and global conflict over freedom of expression. The title itself alluded to a disputed episode in early Islamic history, a subject rarely spoken of publicly and considered extremely sensitive. Rushdie's fictional treatment of it, woven into a narrative of identity, migration, and the collision of cultures, struck many as offensive. For others, it was simply a novel exploring the complexities of belief and doubt. But governments across the Muslim world did not see it as literature. They saw it as blasphemy. Within months of publication, the book was banned in India, Rushdie's country of birth. Soon after, it was prohibited in Pakistan, South Africa, and several Middle Eastern nations. Importation was restricted, libraries removed it from shelves, and booksellers who attempted to distribute it were threatened. In some cities, protests broke out, copies of the novel were burned, and violence erupted. The controversy was no longer confined to the printed word. It had spilled into the streets. The most dramatic turn came in February 1989, when Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran issued a fatwa, a religious decree, calling for the death of Salman Rushdie and those associated with the book's publication. This transformed the dispute from a matter of censorship into a life-and-death struggle. The author was forced into hiding under police protection, moving from safe house to safe house, while translators and publishers around the world faced attacks. In Japan, Rushdie's Japanese translator was murdered. In Italy and Norway, others were stabbed and injured. The atmosphere surrounding the book became one of fear and secrecy. Western governments faced a dilemma. On one side was the principle of free expression, the idea that writers should be able to publish their work without threat of violence. On the other side was the reality of diplomatic tension, as the fatwa sparked crises in international relations. Some countries severed ties with Iran, while others sought compromise. The book itself became less important than the symbolic battle it represented, the clash between freedom of speech and religious sensitivity, between individual rights and collective outrage. For Rushdie, the years that followed were marked by isolation. He lived under assumed names with constant security presence, unable to appear in public freely. Despite the protection, he continued to write, but the shadow of the fatwa never disappeared. In many countries, the ban remained, and possession of the book could carry consequences. Even in nations that did not officially ban it, many bookstores refused to stock it out of fear. Over time, some restrictions softened. In the early 2000s, the Iranian government distanced itself from the fatwa, although it was never formally rescinded. The book, meanwhile, continued to circulate underground in countries where it was banned, passed quietly from reader to reader. For those who sought it, reading it became not just an act of literary interest, but also a gesture of defiance. The controversy around the Satanic Verses revealed how a single work of fiction could provoke global upheaval. It showed how governments could attempt to suppress ideas by controlling access to books, and how those efforts could amplify the book's power rather than diminish it. For supporters of Rushdie, the novel became a symbol of resistance against censorship. For opponents, it was seen as proof of the danger of literature that crossed sacred boundaries. Decades later, the Satanic Verses remains both a celebrated and forbidden book. In some places, it is freely available and taught as part of the literary canon of the 20th century. In others, it is still considered too dangerous to distribute. Its legacy is not only the story Rushdie told within its pages, but also the story of what happened outside them. Governments suppressing knowledge, people risking their lives to protect or destroy a book, and the enduring reminder that words can hold power far beyond what their author may have intended. 1984 by George Orwell. In 1949, George Orwell published a novel that would forever shape the way people think about power, control, and freedom. 1984, commonly known simply as 1984, was not only a work of fiction but a profound warning about the dangers of authoritarianism. Written in the aftermath of World War II, when much of the world was rebuilding from destruction and confronting new political realities, the book imagined a future where surveillance and propaganda ruled every aspect of life. The story of 1984 was unsettling from the first page. Orwell described a world where the government, known as the Party, maintained total control over the population. Individuality was crushed, independent thought was punished, and language itself was reshaped to eliminate the possibility of rebellion. The novel introduced concepts that have since become part of everyday speech: Big Brother, thought crime, doublethink, and the Ministry of Truth. Each of these ideas revealed a chilling vision of a society where truth could be manipulated and reality itself could be rewritten by those in power. When the book appeared, it struck a nerve. Some readers saw it as a direct critique of Stalinist Russia, with its culture of purges, secret police, and propaganda. Others saw in it echoes of Nazi Germany, where loyalty to the regime was enforced through fear and ideology. But Orwell's warning extended beyond specific governments. He suggested that any system, given enough power and unchecked authority, could slide into the same kind of control. Because of its sharp political message, 1984 quickly became a target for suppression. In the Soviet Union, the book was banned almost immediately. Officials recognized that its portrayal of constant surveillance, censorship, and the rewriting of history was far too close to their own practices. The novel circulated underground in samizdat form, secretly copied and passed between readers who risked punishment for possessing it. For many in Eastern Europe, reading 1984 was an act of resistance, a way of naming the reality they lived under. The book also faced censorship in other parts of the world. In the United States, at different points in the 1960s and 1970s, it was challenged and removed from school libraries, often for its political themes or sexual content. In the 1980s, some conservative groups in the U.S. criticized it for being pro-communist, while in communist countries it was condemned as anti-communist. The irony was striking. Governments on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum each found reasons to suppress the same book. The controversy surrounding 1984 was not limited to official bans. In South Korea, during the years of authoritarian rule, the book was considered subversive and was often restricted. In Myanmar, it was banned for decades because of its criticism of dictatorship. Even today, in certain countries, its availability is limited or closely monitored. Each attempt at suppression has only reinforced the novel's reputation as one of the most dangerous books ever written. Part of what made 1984 so threatening was its precision. Orwell had been a journalist and essayist before turning to fiction, and his descriptions of manipulation and control felt deeply plausible. The Ministry of Truth, tasked with constantly rewriting historical records so that the party was always correct, mirrored real efforts by governments to distort history. The practice of thought crime, where even unspoken dissent could be punished, captured the fear of living under constant surveillance. These details gave the novel a weight that readers recognized as more than imagination. The effect of 1984 spread far beyond literature. In the decades after its publication, activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens used Orwell's language to describe their own struggles against censorship and authoritarianism. The phrase, "Big Brother is watching you," became shorthand for intrusive surveillance. Terms like doublethink and newspeak gave people the vocabulary to understand how governments could twist language to shape thought. For this reason, governments that sought total control often saw the book itself as a dangerous weapon, not because of its story, but because of the words it gave to those who resisted. Despite censorship, 1984 endured. Copies were smuggled across borders, read in secret, and shared in underground reading groups. The very act of reading it, in places where it was banned, carried a sense of rebellion. It was more than a novel. It was a mirror held up to societies that wanted to believe such futures could never come to pass. Over time, 1984 entered the global consciousness in a way few books ever have. It became a symbol of the fight for freedom of thought and expression. Universities taught it as a cornerstone of modern literature. Activists cited it in protests. Politicians referred to it both as a warning and, sometimes, as a weapon against their opponents. Yet in every case, its core message remained unchanged. The preservation of truth and the defense of individuality are fragile, and without vigilance, they can be lost. Today, 1984 continues to be both celebrated and challenged. In some regions, it is required reading, while in others it remains under suspicion. Its power lies in its simplicity and clarity. By imagining a world where every word, every thought, and every action is controlled, Orwell forced readers to recognize the value of their own freedom. For this reason, governments that sought to silence dissent tried to suppress the book. But in doing so, they only strengthened its message. The story of 1984 is not just about a fictional dystopia. It is also the story of how a single book became a global symbol banned, censored, feared, and revered all at once. Governments may have tried to hide it, but the ideas within it proved impossible to contain. For Rushdie, the years that followed were marked by isolation. He lived under assumed names with constant security presence, unable to appear in public freely. Despite the protection, he continued to write, but the shadow of the fatwa never disappeared. In many countries, the ban remained, and possession of the book could carry consequences. Even in nations that did not officially ban it, many bookstores refused to stock it out of fear. Over time, some restrictions softened. In the early 2000s, the Iranian government distanced itself from the fatwa, although it was never formally rescinded. The book, meanwhile, continued to circulate underground in countries where it was banned, passed quietly from reader to reader. For those who sought it, reading it became not just an act of literary interest, but also a gesture of defiance. The controversy around the Satanic verses revealed how a single work of fiction could provoke global upheaval. It showed how governments could attempt to suppress ideas by controlling access to books, and how those efforts could amplify the book's power rather than diminish it. For supporters of Rushdie, the novel became a symbol of resistance against censorship. For opponents, it was seen as proof of the danger of literature that crossed sacred boundaries. Decades later, the Satanic verses remains both a celebrated and forbidden book. In some places, it is freely available and taught as part of the literary canon of the 20th century. In others, it is still considered too dangerous to distribute. Its legacy is not only the story Rushdie told within its pages, but also the story of what happened outside them. Governments suppressing knowledge, people risking their lives to protect or destroy a book, and the enduring reminder that words can hold power far beyond what their author may have intended. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. In 1932, Aldous Huxley published a novel that unsettled readers with its vision of a world engineered for stability at the cost of individuality. Brave New World was a story of the future, but not one filled with ruin and devastation. Instead, it imagined a society where comfort and order were guaranteed, where conflict had been eliminated, and where happiness was manufactured through science. On the surface, it looked like utopia. Beneath it, Huxley revealed something darker. A society stripped of freedom, depth, and meaning. The world of Brave New World was ruled not by violence but by conditioning. From birth, every citizen's place in society was determined. People were divided into castes, from the intellectual elite to the laboring masses, and each group was trained to accept its role without question. Babies were created in laboratories rather than born naturally, and their education began before they could even speak. Through methods of suggestion and repetition, they were taught to love their destiny and avoid dangerous thoughts. There was no war, no hunger, and no poverty, but there was also no room for individuality or true human connection. Central to Huxley's vision was a drug called soma, offered freely to all citizens. Whenever someone felt discomfort, anxiety, or sadness, soma provided instant relief. It erased pain, but it also erased the need to confront reality. In this way, the government maintained peace not through fear, but through pleasure. Entertainment, consumption, and distraction filled every day. The pursuit of knowledge was unnecessary, art was reduced to shallow amusement, and history was forgotten. It was a society where truth had been replaced by comfort. When the book was first published, it was controversial. Some praised it as a brilliant and unsettling critique of modernity. Others condemned it as immoral, pointing to its frank discussions of sexuality, its depiction of drug use, and its dismissal of traditional family values. In the decades that followed, as the world moved through wars, technological revolutions, and social upheavals, Brave New World was repeatedly challenged, censored, and banned. In the United States, the novel faced opposition in schools and libraries for its sexual content and its perceived attack on religion. Parents argued that it encouraged promiscuity and undermined morality. In 1980, it was removed from classrooms in Maryland for being anti-family. In 1993, a school district in California challenged it for containing insensitive language and for portraying Native people in what critics called a negative way. Each time, the book returned, defended by educators and free speech advocates as one of the most important works of modern literature. Outside the United States, Brave New World also faced restrictions. In Ireland, the book was banned soon after publication for its treatment of religion and sexuality. In India, some authorities challenged its circulation for similar reasons. In countries with authoritarian governments, its critique of conformity and state control was considered dangerous. The irony was clear. A book about the suppression of individuality was itself repeatedly suppressed. What made Brave New World so threatening to those in power was not only its vision of the future but the questions it raised about the present. Huxley's world was not one of obvious tyranny. It was not built on fear, like Orwell's 1984, but on satisfaction. People did not resist because they had no reason to resist. Their lives were filled with distractions, comforts, and pleasures, leaving no space for rebellion. For readers, this raised the unsettling possibility that freedom could be lost not through oppression but through the quiet surrender of curiosity and desire for meaning. The book's endurance over time came from its relevance. In the 1950s, as consumer culture expanded, readers saw echoes of Huxley's warnings in advertising and mass entertainment. In the 1960s, amid social revolutions and the rise of new drugs, the parallels to Soma seemed immediate. In later decades, as technology advanced and entertainment grew more immersive, the novel appeared almost prophetic. Each generation found in it a reflection of its own anxieties. Despite bans and challenges, Brave New World continued to spread. Universities taught it as a classic of dystopian fiction, pairing it with Orwell's 1984. Together, the two novels offered contrasting but complementary visions. One of control through fear, the other of control through pleasure. Readers who encountered both works often saw them not as opposites but as two halves of the same warning. Governments might suppress thought by punishing dissent, or they might suppress thought by distracting and pacifying. Either way, the result was the same, the erosion of freedom. Today, Brave New World remains both relevant and contested. In some classrooms, it is celebrated as essential reading. In others, it is still challenged for the same reasons it was decades ago. Its depictions of sexuality, its critique of religion, its bleak view of human nature. But beyond controversy, the novel has secured a place in history as one of the most influential books of the 20th century. Its presence on lists of banned and challenged books only reinforces its significance, reminding readers that the ideas Huxley explored continue to unsettle and provoke. The suppression of Brave New World is not only the story of governments and schools attempting to control access to it. It is also the story of how readers, despite restrictions, have sought it out, debated it, and carried its warnings forward. In this way, the novel has outlived every attempt to silence it. Its vision of a future where freedom is exchanged for comfort lingers, serving as a quiet reminder of what can be lost when society values ease above truth. The Anarchist Cookbook by William Powell. In 1971, a young man named William Powell published a book that would become one of the most controversial manuals of the 20th century. He called it the Anarchist Cookbook, and unlike works of political philosophy or fiction, this was not a novel nor a piece of literature in the traditional sense. It was a practical guide, filled with instructions that many believed should never be written down. Within its pages were recipes for explosives, methods for sabotage, and descriptions of drugs and weapons. Powell, at the time only 19 years old, compiled the book out of frustration with the government of the United States and its involvement in the Vietnam War. What he could not have anticipated was how far the book would spread, how deeply it would be condemned, and how fiercely governments would try to suppress it. Powell's motivation was, in his own words, rooted in anger. He felt alienated by the political climate of the late 1960s, a period marked by protests, violence, and mistrust of authority. His response was to gather information, much of it taken from public military manuals and technical guides, and compile it into one volume. The book contained instructions on making homemade bombs, poisons, and incendiary devices. It also included sections on hacking, survivalism, and techniques of subversion. To Powell, it was an act of rebellion, a way of turning knowledge against those in power. To governments, however, it was an immediate threat. From the beginning, the Anarchist Cookbook faced intense opposition. The Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States monitored its publication, though it stopped short of banning it outright. In other countries, including the United Kingdom and Australia, the book was restricted, with police authorized to seize copies from bookstores and individuals. Law enforcement agencies argued that it provided dangerous knowledge to those who might use it for criminal or violent purposes. In some cases, the book was cited in trials where individuals had followed its instructions to build harmful devices. Each incident strengthened the argument that it was not just a book but a weapon. Despite this, the book was never completely suppressed. Part of the reason was legal. In the United States, strong protections for freedom of speech made it difficult to ban outright. Courts repeatedly ruled that, unless directly tied to criminal intent, possession of the book could not be considered a crime. This created a paradox. On the one hand, authorities sought to limit its circulation, while on the other hand, the very act of trying to suppress it gave it more attention. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Anarchist Cookbook had become infamous, often mentioned in news stories and whispered about among young people curious about forbidden texts. The rise of the Internet gave the book a second life. Scanned copies circulated online, spreading far beyond what Powell had ever imagined. Governments attempted to remove it from websites, but each attempt at censorship was quickly undone as the file appeared again on other servers. For some, downloading the book became an act of defiance, even if they never attempted to use the instructions. It was a symbol of forbidden knowledge, a reminder that information, once written, is nearly impossible to contain. For William Powell himself, the story took a different turn. In later years, he came to regret writing the Anarchist Cookbook. After leaving the United States and becoming a teacher abroad, he distanced himself from the work and spoke openly about the harm it had caused. He expressed shame that his youthful anger had created something that could be used for violence. In interviews, he pleaded with publishers to withdraw the book, and he spent much of his life working in education, advocating for peace and constructive approaches to conflict. But by then, the book had taken on a life of its own. It remained in circulation, beyond his control, endlessly copied and redistributed. The suppression of the Anarchist Cookbook differed from the banning of works of fiction or philosophy. Governments did not see it as dangerous because of ideas or beliefs. They saw it as dangerous because it provided practical instructions. This distinction made it one of the most unique cases of censorship in modern history. Where novels like 1984 or Brave New World were banned for their political warnings, Powell's book was restricted for its technical content. And yet, the result was the same. Attempts to erase it only drew more attention, turning it into a cultural artifact of rebellion. Today, the book still carries a reputation that is both notorious and symbolic. It is cited in debates about free speech, censorship, and the limits of information. Some argue that it should never have been published, while others insist that suppressing it sets a dangerous precedent for controlling knowledge. Its continued presence in libraries, on digital platforms, and in underground circulation is a reminder of how difficult it is to silence a text once it enters the world. The legacy of the Anarchist Cookbook is complex. It is not celebrated as a great literary work, nor is it remembered for artistic merit. Instead, it stands as a case study in the power of information itself. Written by a teenager in a moment of frustration, it became a global symbol of forbidden knowledge, chased by governments, condemned by its author, and sought out by those drawn to what is hidden. The story of its suppression reflects a larger truth. Knowledge, once shared, cannot easily be contained, even when it frightens those in power. Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. In 1957, a Russian novel was published outside the Soviet Union that would change the way the world looked at literature and at censorship itself. That book was Dr. Zhivago, written by Boris Pasternak, one of Russia's most gifted poets and novelists. To the outside world, it was a masterpiece. A sweeping story of love, loss, and survival set against the backdrop of revolution and civil war. To the Soviet authorities, however, it was something else entirely. It was a threat, not because it openly called for rebellion, but because it portrayed the revolution and its aftermath in a way that was deeply human, complex, and far from the heroic image that official ideology demanded. Pasternak had worked on the novel for many years, carefully crafting the story of Yuri Zhivago, a physician and poet caught in the chaos of the Russian Revolution. Through Zhivago's experiences, the novel depicted not only the violence of war, but also the moral and emotional costs of living in a society reshaped by ideology. The book did not condemn revolution outright, nor did it glorify it. Instead, it showed its ambiguities. How ordinary people were broken, displaced, and silenced in the name of progress. For Soviet leaders, this was unacceptable. Literature was supposed to serve the state, to celebrate its victories and reinforce its legitimacy. Dr. Zhivago did none of this. When Pasternak tried to publish the manuscript in Moscow, it was rejected by every state-controlled publisher. Officials called it politically harmful, accusing it of spreading confusion and doubt about the meaning of the revolution. But the novel did not disappear. A smuggled manuscript made its way to Italy, where the publisher Giangiacomo Feltrinelli released it in 1957. The book was an immediate sensation. Readers in the West hailed it as a brilliant work of art, and soon it was translated into dozens of languages. For the Soviet Union, this was a humiliation. A Russian novel written by a Russian author celebrated worldwide while being banned in its own homeland. The story did not end there. In 1958, Dr. Zhivago was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. The announcement sent shockwaves through Moscow. Pasternak became the first Soviet citizen to receive the prize for literature, but the honor quickly turned into a nightmare. Soviet authorities launched a fierce campaign against him. Newspapers published articles calling him a traitor. Writers who had once admired him were pressured into signing letters condemning his work. Under immense political and personal pressure, Pasternak was forced to decline the Nobel Prize. He lived the rest of his life in isolation, closely watched and largely silenced. The suppression of Dr. Zhivago was not only an act of censorship but also an attempt to erase a narrative that challenged the official story of the revolution. The Soviet Union wanted literature to portray history as a march toward progress and collective triumph. Pasternak's novel instead focused on individual suffering, on the private lives that were disrupted by politics. The authorities feared that such a perspective could weaken faith in the system, inspire doubt, or encourage resistance. Ironically, the effort to suppress the novel only made it more powerful. In the West, it became a symbol of the struggle for artistic freedom under authoritarian rule. The CIA even recognized its potential as a tool in the cultural Cold War. Declassified documents later revealed that the agency helped distribute copies of Dr. Zhivago behind the Iron Curtain, hoping to undermine Soviet control over information. To read Pasternak's banned novel in secret was, for many, an act of quiet rebellion. For Pasternak himself, the experience was both triumphant and tragic. He had always considered himself a poet first, and Dr. Zhivago was his only full-length novel. Though it brought him international fame, it also brought him misery at home. He died in 1960, only 2 years after being forced to reject the Nobel Prize, without ever seeing his novel published freely in his own country. It was not until 1988, during the era of perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev, that Dr. Zhivago was finally published in the Soviet Union. By then, it was already a classic, its reputation secured. Readers who had grown up hearing about the book in whispers could at last hold it in their hands openly. For many, it was a revelation, not just as a literary masterpiece but as a reminder of how much had been silenced. The suppression of Dr. Zhivago stands as one of the most striking examples of the power of literature to unsettle those in authority. Unlike manifestos or pamphlets, novels work through empathy, by drawing readers into the inner lives of characters. Pasternak did not need to deliver political arguments. Instead, he told a story of human beings caught in history's storms, that, in the eyes of his government, was more dangerous than open dissent. Today, Dr. Zhivago continues to be read around the world, admired both for its artistry and for the history it carries. It is remembered not only as a love story and a chronicle of revolution, but also as a symbol of how literature can endure even when it is silenced. Pasternak once wrote that a book belongs not to its author but to its readers. His novel, suppressed and condemned in his lifetime, eventually returned to the people for whom it was written. And in that return lies its lasting triumph. Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller. In 1934, in the heart of Paris, a book appeared that would become one of the most controversial works of the 20th century. Its title was Tropic of Cancer, and its author was Henry Miller, an American expatriate who had left the United States in search of freedom and self-expression. What he found in Paris was both poverty and inspiration, and out of those experiences came a novel that shattered literary conventions, challenged social norms, and forced entire governments to decide what could and could not be read. At its core, Tropic of Cancer was not a traditional novel. It did not follow a clear plot, nor did it concern itself with polite storytelling. Instead, it was a stream of consciousness, raw and unfiltered, blending autobiography with fiction, philosophy with vulgarity. Miller described his struggles as a writer in Paris, his encounters with friends, strangers, and lovers, and his reflections on life, art, and society. His language was often explicit, his imagery bold, and his honesty relentless. For Miller, writing was not about crafting a moral tale but about capturing life in all its chaotic and contradictory forms. When it was first published in France by the Obelisk Press, Tropic of Cancer immediately attracted attention. Writers such as Anais Nin, who was both a close friend and supporter of Miller, helped champion the book. In literary circles, it was praised for its daring originality, its rejection of censorship, and its unflinching exploration of human experience. Yet in many other places, especially in Miller's homeland, the reaction was far less welcoming. In the United States, Tropic of Cancer was declared obscene almost immediately. Copies that reached American shores were seized by customs officials. The book was banned in several states, and anyone caught distributing it risked prosecution. Courts ruled that the novel contained material so indecent that it had no redeeming social value. The obscenity label was applied again and again, effectively silencing the book in the country where Miller was born. The censorship extended beyond America. In the United Kingdom, Tropic of Cancer was also banned, its frank depictions of sexuality deemed unacceptable for public consumption. The novel became an underground object, whispered about, smuggled across borders, and read in secret by those who were curious about what made it so dangerous. To governments, it was a threat to morality and public order. To readers, it was a glimpse of a new kind of literature, one that refused to obey traditional boundaries. For decades, Miller lived under the shadow of this censorship. He continued to write, producing works such as Tropic of Capricorn and Black Spring, which faced similar restrictions. Critics and defenders of free expression argued passionately over whether his books were art or obscenity. The debate reflected larger questions about literature's role in society. Should it uplift and instruct, or should it confront the realities that people preferred to ignore? By the 1950s, the conversation around censorship began to shift. American culture was changing, and so were its courts. Writers and publishers challenged obscenity laws, arguing that literature, even when explicit, deserved protection under the principles of free speech. The turning point came in 1961, when Grove Press decided to publish Tropic of Cancer openly in the United States. The decision triggered a wave of lawsuits across the country as officials sought to block the book's circulation. What followed was a remarkable series of legal battles. Case by case, judges were forced to consider whether Miller's work was truly obscene or whether it contained literary merit. Supporters of the book pointed to its influence on modern literature, its innovative style, and its philosophical depth. Detractors saw only its raw and graphic content. The debate reached the Supreme Court in 1964, when the justices issued a landmark ruling that protected Tropic of Cancer under the First Amendment. The court declared that the book, while controversial, could not be suppressed simply because it offended some readers. It was a moment that reshaped American law and expanded the boundaries of artistic freedom. For Henry Miller, the legalization of Tropic of Cancer was both a victory and a vindication. By the time of the ruling, he was in his 70s, having spent much of his life branded as a writer of banned books. Yet his persistence, and the persistence of those who believed in his work, had altered the landscape of literature. No longer could governments so easily silence a novel for its content. The case set a precedent that would protect countless other works in the years to come. Today, Tropic of Cancer is recognized as a modern classic. It is studied in universities, analyzed for its style and themes, and remembered as a turning point in the fight against censorship. For many readers, its rawness still shocks, but it also reveals the power of literature to break down barriers and to speak honestly about the human condition. The story of its suppression reminds us that books are often banned not because they are weak but because they are strong. Miller's novel did not conform to polite expectations, and in doing so, it forced society to confront questions about freedom, morality, and art. The governments that tried to suppress it only ensured its place in history. What was once forbidden is now celebrated, and in that transformation lies the enduring power of the written word. Ulysses by James Joyce. In the early decades of the 20th century, literature was undergoing a transformation. Writers were no longer content with traditional forms of storytelling. They experimented with language, structure, and perspective, trying to capture the complexity of modern life. At the forefront of this revolution was an Irish writer named James Joyce. His great experiment, Ulysses, published in 1922, would become one of the most celebrated novels of the century, and one of the most censored. Ulysses was unlike anything that had come before it. Modeled loosely on Homer's Odyssey, it told the story of a single day in Dublin, June 16, 1904, as experienced by Leopold Bloom, a Jewish advertising agent, and several other characters. Instead of epic battles or heroic quests, the novel followed the ordinary rhythms of life. Conversations, meals, errands, memories, and daydreams. Yet through Joyce's innovative use of stream-of-consciousness narration, these everyday moments became vast inner landscapes. Readers were plunged directly into the characters' minds, with all their wandering thoughts, desires, and doubts. But this groundbreaking style came with consequences. Joyce refused to sanitize human experience. He wrote frankly about the body, about sexuality, about thoughts that polite society considered unfit for literature. In one of the novel's most controversial passages, known as the Nausicaa episode, Leopold Bloom observes a young woman on the beach, and his inner arousal is described in explicit, though fragmented, detail. For Joyce, it was a bold attempt to capture the truth of human consciousness. For censors, it was enough to condemn the book as obscene. The trouble began even before Ulysses was published in full. Portions of the novel appeared in the American magazine The Little Review between 1918 and 1920. When the Nausicaa episode was printed, authorities intervened. The editors of the magazine were brought to trial in New York for obscenity. They were found guilty, fined, and ordered to cease publishing Joyce's work. As a result, Ulysses was effectively banned in the United States, long before it had reached the public in book form. Despite these setbacks, Joyce continued writing. In 1922, the novel was finally published in Paris by Sylvia Beach, the American owner of the bookshop Shakespeare and Company. It caused an immediate sensation in literary circles. Writers such as T.S. Eliot and Ernest Hemingway recognized it as a masterpiece, though not always an easy one. To them, Joyce had captured the chaos and richness of modern consciousness. But outside these circles, Ulysses quickly became notorious. Customs officials in both the United States and the United Kingdom seized copies as they arrived. Libraries and bookstores were warned against carrying the book. Governments declared it obscene, citing not only its sexual content but also its unorthodox style, which many critics could not even comprehend. For decades, Ulysses could not be purchased legally in English-speaking countries. Readers who wanted it had to seek out smuggled copies or travel abroad. The ban turned Ulysses into a symbol of the struggle between artistic freedom and censorship. Defenders of Joyce argued that the book's innovations were essential to the progress of literature. They pointed out that while the novel contained passages of explicit thought, it was not pornographic in intention. Instead, it sought to portray life truthfully, without the filters of convention or propriety. Opponents insisted that the book degraded morals and could not be tolerated in public circulation. The conflict reached its climax in the 1930s. In 1933, Random House, an American publisher, deliberately imported a copy of Ulysses into New York, fully expecting it to be seized. When it was, they initiated a legal challenge. The case, United States v. One book called Ulysses was heard by Judge John M. Woolsey in federal court. Woolsey's decision became one of the most important in the history of literary censorship. In his ruling, he acknowledged that the novel contained frank language and themes but argued that it did not incite lustful thoughts or appeal to prurient interests. Instead, he recognized it as a serious work of art, one that used experimental techniques to illuminate the human mind. He concluded that Ulysses was not obscene and should be allowed into the United States. The ruling was a watershed moment. It overturned the ban, opened the door for the novel's publication, and set a precedent that protected future works from censorship. For the first time, the law recognized that literature could be challenging, provocative, even disturbing without being obscene. The decision marked a victory not only for Joyce but also for the broader principle of artistic freedom. Once legalized, Ulysses quickly gained recognition as a cornerstone of modernist literature. Scholars studied its intricate structure, its parallels to Homer, its linguistic experiments, and its psychological depth. What had once been considered dangerous and corrupting was now hailed as genius. The very passages that censors tried to suppress became the focus of academic interpretation, showing how subjective judgments of morality could shape and distort the fate of art. For Joyce, the victory came late but was deeply significant. He had lived for years in relative poverty and exile, facing hostility from publishers and governments. By the time the ban was lifted, he was an established figure in literary circles but still a man marked by years of struggle. He never lived to see the full extent of his influence, as he died in 1941, but his work continued to resonate long after. Today, Ulysses is often described as one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. It remains challenging to read, with its shifting styles, dense allusions, and unflinching honesty. Yet its impact is undeniable. It reshaped the possibilities of literature, expanded the limits of narrative, and forced societies to reconsider what could be said, and how. The history of its censorship is a reminder of how easily art can be silenced when judged only by surface impressions. What governments once sought to suppress now stands as a cultural monument. In the long view of history, censorship tends to fail while the written word endures. Ulysses exemplifies this truth. A book once smuggled in secret, now studied openly, its pages carrying not only the voices of its characters, but also the story of freedom hard-won. The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. In the shadows of the Soviet Union, where silence was demanded and truth was tightly controlled, one man began to write the story that the state most feared. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, a former Red Army officer turned dissident writer, had experienced firsthand the machinery of repression. The arrests, the interrogations, the endless sentences to labor camps. Out of these experiences, and from the testimonies of hundreds of fellow prisoners, he began to assemble a work so vast, so uncompromising, that it would come to define the memory of an entire era. That work was the Gulag Archipelago. The title itself was a metaphor. The archipelago was not made of islands in the sea, but of prison camps scattered like a chain across the Soviet Union. Each camp was a node in a vast system of forced labor, surveillance, and punishment. To outsiders, this system was hidden, denied, or downplayed. To those who lived under it, It was a silent threat that shaped every decision, every word spoken aloud. To write about it, let alone to publish such writing, was an act of extraordinary risk. Solzhenitsyn began secretly drafting the Gulag Archipelago in the late 1950s, after his release from the camps. He collected notes from memory, pieced together stories whispered by survivors, and smuggled testimonies through clandestine networks of trust. Every page he wrote was a potential death sentence if discovered by the KGB. For years, the manuscript existed only as fragments hidden in safe houses, in the homes of trusted friends, or committed to memory by those who feared searches and arrests. The manuscript grew into a monumental account, blending history, philosophy, and personal testimony. Solzhenitsyn did not merely describe the physical brutality of the camps, the hunger, the cold, the beatings. He explored the moral dimension of a society that allowed such cruelty to persist. He dissected the psychology of interrogators and prisoners alike, asking how ordinary people could become instruments of repression, and how some managed to preserve their humanity amid degradation. When the first volume was completed in the early 1970s, Solzhenitsyn hoped to publish it abroad at the right moment. But fate accelerated events. In 1973, the KGB discovered one of his trusted typists, who had hidden a copy of the manuscript. Under intense pressure, she revealed its existence, and soon after, she took her own life. A tragic testament to the fear that surrounded the book. Realizing that suppression was now inevitable, Solzhenitsyn rushed the publication abroad. In December 1973, the Gulag Archipelago was released in Paris. The impact was immediate and seismic. Western readers, many of whom had only vague notions of Soviet repression, were confronted with an overwhelming body of evidence. The book shattered illusions about the so-called workers' paradise. It detailed a system that had imprisoned millions, not just criminals but intellectuals, peasants, soldiers, even children. For the first time, the scale of the Soviet labor camps was laid bare, not in dry statistics but in human voices. Inside the Soviet Union, the state reacted with fury. Copies were banned, possession was criminalized, and anyone caught with the book faced severe punishment. The official press denounced Solzhenitsyn as a traitor, a liar, a man corrupted by the West. In 1974, only months after the first volume appeared, Solzhenitsyn was arrested, stripped of his citizenship, and exiled from the Soviet Union. Yet even as the government tried to erase his presence, the book circulated in underground samizdat form, photocopied page by page, hidden in drawers and suitcases, read in whispers late at night. In the West, the book became a political and cultural landmark. It influenced governments, intellectuals, and ordinary readers alike. For those who had doubted or minimized reports of Soviet repression, Solzhenitsyn's account was irrefutable. It armed dissidents in Eastern Europe with moral authority, and it changed the way the Cold War was perceived. No longer could the crimes of Stalinism be dismissed as exaggerations. The voices of the imprisoned had been heard, and they could not be silenced again. But the Gulag Archipelago was more than a political exposé. It was also a meditation on human nature. Solzhenitsyn argued that the line between good and evil does not run between nations or classes, but through every human heart. In the camps, he observed how some individuals betrayed others to save themselves, while others sacrificed everything to preserve a fragment of dignity or compassion. His message was not only about the Soviet system, but about the eternal moral choices that face humanity. The complete work eventually expanded into 3 volumes, totaling more than 1,800 pages. It was not a conventional history, but a mosaic of memories, stories, and reflections, deliberately fragmented to reflect the disjointed reality of life in the camps. Its very form challenged readers to confront chaos, to assemble meaning from broken lives. For years, the Soviet government kept the book suppressed. It was not until the period of glasnost in the late 1980s that the Gulag Archipelago was finally published openly inside Russia. When it appeared in 1989, it sold millions of copies almost immediately. Readers who had grown up in silence now encountered the suppressed history of their own families and communities. The book gave voice to a suffering that had long been denied, and in doing so, it helped reshape the nation's understanding of its past. Even today, the Gulag Archipelago remains a contested text. In some circles, it is revered as one of the greatest works of the 20th century, a book that changed the course of history by exposing a hidden system of oppression. In others, particularly among those who long for a sanitized version of the Soviet past, it is criticized or downplayed. But its existence cannot be undone. It stands as a monument to memory, a testament to endurance, and a warning about the fragility of freedom. The story of its censorship and survival is a reminder that books can outlast the empires that fear them. Written in secrecy, hidden under threat of arrest, smuggled across borders, denounced and banned, the Gulag Archipelago ultimately reached the entire world. It carried not only the weight of Solzhenitsyn's words but also the voices of countless men and women whose suffering might otherwise have been forgotten. In the long silence of repression, Solzhenitsyn broke through with a truth so powerful that even the machinery of censorship could not hold it back. The camps may have been an archipelago of isolation, but the book became an ocean of remembrance, ensuring that what was once hidden in darkness would remain forever in the light. Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. In the late 1920s, when the world was still recovering from the devastation of the First World War, a novel appeared that challenged not just literary conventions, but the very boundaries of what could be written, published, or read. That book was Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, a story that combined raw sensuality with biting social commentary, and one that governments across the globe sought to silence. On the surface, it is the tale of an affair between Constance Reed, an upper-class woman, and Oliver Mellers, the working-class gamekeeper on her husband's estate. But beneath the surface, Lawrence was doing something far more dangerous. He was exposing the hypocrisies of rigid social hierarchies, questioning the emptiness of industrial society, and writing with a frankness about the human body and intimacy that was almost unheard of in its time. The setting of the novel was as important as the characters themselves. Lawrence placed the story in post-war England, a country scarred not only by the trenches but by the cold efficiency of industrial progress. The coal mines loomed in the background, symbols of a mechanized society that had stripped away humanity, joy, and natural connection. Through Constance and Mellers, Lawrence suggested a return to vitality, a reclaiming of the body and spirit in defiance of the sterile, class-bound world. But it was not the philosophy alone that shocked readers and authorities. It was the language. Lawrence wrote with unflinching honesty about physical passion, using words and descriptions that were considered obscene in his era. He did not veil intimacy behind metaphor or euphemism. Instead, he named it directly, breaking one of the strongest taboos in literature. For censors, this was intolerable. When Lawrence completed the novel in 1928, he knew it would never be accepted by the conservative publishers of England. He privately published an edition in Florence, Italy, and distributed copies discreetly to friends and sympathetic readers. Almost immediately, it was banned. The British authorities, invoking the Obscene Publications Act, declared it unfit for public consumption. The book was seized at customs, burned in raids, and forbidden from circulation. The same story unfolded across much of the English-speaking world. In the United States, the novel was banned under federal obscenity laws. In Canada, Australia, and India, customs officers confiscated shipments. Even translations in France and Japan faced scrutiny. To possess the book was, in many places, a crime. Readers who wanted to access it had to seek underground copies, smuggled from abroad or privately circulated in secret. Yet the very act of banning the novel only deepened its allure. Whispers spread about the book too scandalous to print, too dangerous to read. For many, Lady Chatterley's Lover became not just a novel, but a symbol of resistance against censorship and moral repression. The story's notoriety kept it alive, moving through hidden channels while official publishers refused to touch it. Lawrence himself did not live to see the book's eventual vindication. He died in 1930, just 2 years after the novel's completion, worn down by illness and by the relentless criticism he endured as a writer who defied conventions. For decades after his death, his most famous work remained locked in a legal and cultural battle between the defenders of morality and the advocates of artistic freedom. That battle reached its turning point in 1960, more than 30 years after the book was written. Penguin Books sought to publish an unexpurgated edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover in the United Kingdom. The government immediately launched a prosecution under obscenity laws, leading to one of the most famous trials in literary history, Regina versus Penguin Books Ltd. The trial became more than a question of whether a book was obscene. It became a public test of whether society had moved beyond the prudishness of earlier generations. The prosecution argued that the novel's explicit descriptions were degrading, corrupting, and offensive. The defense countered that Lawrence's purpose was not pornography, but art, that he sought to reveal something profound about human connection, love, and authenticity. One moment in the trial became legendary. The prosecutor, Mervyn Griffith-Jones, asked the jury whether this was the kind of book you would wish your wife or servants to read. The phrasing revealed a world still steeped in class arrogance, and it backfired spectacularly. The jury, reflecting a society in the midst of transformation, sided with Penguin. The publisher was acquitted, and the book was finally released in Britain in its complete form. The victory was not just for Lawrence, but for literature itself. The trial marked a turning point in the decline of state censorship. Books that had long been suppressed for their treatment of sex or morality began to appear openly. Writers gained a new freedom to explore subjects once considered untouchable. The publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1960 was more than a literary event. It was a cultural revolution. In the United States, a similar story unfolded. After years of suppression, the book was finally cleared for publication in 1959, when a federal court ruled that it possessed redeeming social importance. This phrase would become a cornerstone in the evolving definition of free expression, protecting literature from censorship as long as it had artistic or intellectual value. Looking back, Lady Chatterley's Lover stands as a paradox. The very thing that made it notorious, its frank language, is now far less shocking to modern readers. Yet the controversy surrounding it reshaped the cultural landscape. By forcing courts and societies to confront questions of morality, class, and freedom of expression, it helped dismantle the barriers that once constrained literature. Today, the novel is read less for its scandal than for its insight into a world caught between old and new values. It reflects the tension of an age that had lost its faith in tradition but had not yet embraced modern openness. Lawrence's insistence on honesty, both emotional and physical, remains a powerful critique of societies that seek to control desire and suppress truth. The long story of its suppression reveals something essential about books themselves. A novel can be banned, burned, denounced, and hidden, but if it carries within it a truth that resonates, it cannot be silenced forever. Lady Chatterley's Lover endured because it was more than explicit scenes on a page. It was a challenge to a society afraid of its own humanity, a reminder that words can liberate as much as they can provoke. For Lawrence, the struggle to publish the book was a personal defeat. He never saw its triumph. But for the generations that followed, his work became a symbol of artistic defiance, proving that literature has the power to push boundaries, reshape morality, and ultimately outlast the forces that try to suppress it. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. When J.D. Salinger published The Catcher in the Rye in 1951, he likely could not have predicted the cultural storm it would unleash. On the surface, it was a modest novel, the story of a disillusioned teenager wandering through New York City over the course of a few days. Yet beneath that simple plot, Salinger had tapped into something raw, unsettling, and profoundly resonant. The voice of youth in rebellion, stripped of politeness, and unwilling to conform to society's expectations. The novel introduces us to Holden Caulfield, a 16-year-old who has just been expelled from yet another prep school. Restless, angry, and searching for meaning, Holden narrates his experiences in a stream of thought that is by turns cynical, bitter, vulnerable, and deeply human. He rails against phonies, a word he uses to describe the insincerity and hypocrisy he sees everywhere, in adults, in institutions, in the world itself. Yet beneath his disdain lies loneliness and longing, a desperate need for authenticity in a society that seems built on pretense. It was this honesty, in Holden's voice and in Salinger's writing, that both electrified young readers and alarmed parents, teachers, and authorities. The novel's language was shockingly direct for its time. Holden curses casually, mocks religion, and speaks with frankness about alcohol, smoking, and sex. In 1951, such openness was almost unthinkable in a book intended for the general public, let alone one that would soon be read widely by teenagers. Within months of its publication, The Catcher in the Rye became both a bestseller and a target. In schools across the United States, parents demanded it be removed from reading lists. They objected to the profanity, the depictions of teenage rebellion, and the novel's apparent rejection of authority. Some accused it of promoting immorality. Others went further, calling it dangerous, corrupting, even subversive. The American Library Association eventually placed The Catcher in the Rye near the top of its lists of most frequently challenged books. Throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, it was banned or restricted in schools and libraries in dozens of states. Teachers who assigned it sometimes faced angry protests, and in some districts they risked losing their jobs. But the controversy did not end with classroom debates. The book became entangled in real-world violence, which only deepened its notoriety. In 1980, when John Lennon was murdered in New York City, police discovered that his killer, Mark David Chapman, was carrying a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He claimed the book was his statement, calling himself Holden Caulfield and insisting that the novel explained his actions. Later, other violent criminals would also cite the book, further fueling fears that Salinger's novel had a dark influence. Authorities, of course, responded by renewing efforts to ban it. In the public imagination, The Catcher in the Rye became not just a book about teenage discontent, but a potential catalyst for rebellion, dissent, even violence. It was whispered about as if it carried some dangerous energy, capable of infecting impressionable minds. And yet, despite all this, or perhaps because of it, the novel only grew in cultural significance. To generations of readers, Holden Caulfield's voice was not a call to destruction but a mirror. Here was a character who articulated feelings of alienation and frustration that countless young people recognized but rarely saw expressed so honestly in literature. Holden's rebellion against phoniness, his refusal to accept easy answers, and his longing to protect innocence resonated in ways that no censorship could erase. Salinger himself became almost as mysterious as his protagonist. After the novel's publication, he withdrew increasingly from public life, refusing interviews and avoiding the literary spotlight. He published only a handful of works afterward and eventually stopped publishing altogether. His retreat from fame only added to the novel's mythos, as if Holden's disdain for society had been echoed in the author's own life. By the late 20th century, the novel had become a rite of passage for many readers. Teachers who once shunned it began to defend it as an essential exploration of adolescence. Scholars analyzed it not as a corrupting influence, but as a powerful critique of post-war American conformity. While some parents still objected to its language and themes, others recognized that the very struggles Holden expressed were ones their children were living: confusion, isolation, and the search for identity in a world that felt hostile and insincere. Today, The Catcher in the Rye still sparks debate. In some places, it remains challenged, its language and themes deemed too raw for young audiences. Yet it also remains one of the most widely taught and discussed novels in modern literature. What was once considered obscene is now recognized as a milestone in the honest portrayal of youth. The history of its suppression tells a larger story about society's discomfort with voices that refuse to conform. Holden Caulfield, fictional though he is, embodies a perspective that unsettles the established order. Not because he advocates revolution, but because he insists on truth. He strips away the polite facades of adulthood and exposes the emptiness beneath them. For authorities, such honesty is threatening. For readers, it is liberating. In the end, the attempts to silence The Catcher in the Rye only amplified its impact. Each ban, each protest, each association with scandal reinforced the sense that the book mattered, that it spoke to something urgent and real. Like many works once suppressed, it outlived its critics and cemented its place in the literary canon. Salinger, through Holden's restless voice, captured the timeless struggle between individuality and conformity, authenticity and hypocrisy. That is why, Despite decades of censorship and controversy, The Catcher in the Rye continues to be read, debated, and cherished. It stands as a reminder that the most unsettling truths are often the ones most worth telling, and that no amount of suppression can silence a story that resonates so deeply with the human experience. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Few novels capture the fear of censorship as vividly as Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury's dystopian masterpiece first published in 1953. At its core lies a haunting image, a future society where books are outlawed and firemen do not extinguish flames but instead ignite them, burning literature wherever it is found. The story follows Guy Montag, a fireman who begins to question the system he serves, eventually rebelling against the state's attempt to erase thought, memory, and history. Bradbury's vision was born in the anxious years of post-war America. The 1950s were marked by Cold War paranoia, political witch hunts, and the rise of mass media, which threatened to replace thoughtful engagement with shallow entertainment. For Bradbury, who had grown up during the Great Depression and witnessed both Nazi book burnings and American debates over censorship, the image of flames devouring books was not a far-fetched fantasy. It was a warning about what happens when fear and conformity silence curiosity. The title itself refers to the temperature at which paper supposedly ignites, 451 degrees Fahrenheit. It was both literal and symbolic, a reminder that knowledge can be destroyed quickly, and that the fragility of ideas often lies not in their content, but in the willingness of a society to preserve or erase them. Ironically, a book written to condemn censorship soon became a target of censorship itself. Almost as soon as it was published, parents and educators began to challenge it. They objected to its language, its themes of rebellion, and its dark portrayal of society. Some schools refused to assign it, while others only allowed edited versions. The most striking example occurred in the 1960s, when Ballantine Books released a special edition for schools. Without Bradbury's consent, they quietly altered or removed nearly 70 passages from the text. Profanity was deleted, mild curse words were softened, and controversial themes were minimized. Even descriptions of drinking and smoking were censored. What made this act particularly ironic was that it mirrored the very world Bradbury had warned about, a world where uncomfortable ideas were smoothed over until only a bland, acceptable version of reality remained. For years, students across America unknowingly read this censored version of Fahrenheit 451. Bradbury only discovered the alterations later, and he was furious. He insisted that the original text be restored and made it clear that the novel itself was meant as a warning against exactly this kind of suppression. The episode became one of the most famous examples of the irony of censorship. A book about banning books was itself banned and rewritten. Yet the controversies did not end there. Throughout the 20th century, Fahrenheit 451 appeared on lists of frequently challenged books. Some schools and libraries restricted it for its offensive language or questionable themes. Others objected to its portrayal of authority figures and its suggestion that government might deliberately manipulate citizens by controlling information. In certain conservative districts, the book was considered unpatriotic, too critical of American society during the Cold War. But beyond the classroom, the novel gained a reputation as one of the defining works of dystopian literature, alongside Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. While Orwell imagined a world of constant surveillance and Huxley envisioned a society numbed by pleasure, Bradbury focused on distraction, censorship, and willful ignorance. His fear was not only that governments might suppress knowledge, but that citizens themselves might abandon it, trading books for television, silence for comfort, and freedom for entertainment. This theme made Fahrenheit 451 especially powerful in the television age. Bradbury himself worried that screens were eroding literacy, that the quick flashes of imagery were replacing the deeper, slower engagement of reading. In many ways, his concerns proved prophetic. Debates about attention spans, mass media, and digital distraction feel eerily similar to the warnings woven into Montag's journey. The suppression of Fahrenheit 451 reflects society's ongoing unease with its message. It challenges authority by suggesting that censorship is not only imposed from above, but also embraced from below, when people choose convenience over truth. It portrays a culture where difficult conversations are avoided, where offense is feared more than ignorance, and where books are seen not as treasures but as threats. In the decades since its publication, Bradbury's novel has been translated into dozens of languages, adapted into films, plays, and even graphic novels. Yet in many classrooms it is still challenged. Parents continue to raise objections to its language or its themes, sometimes missing the larger point that the novel is itself a defense of free expression. Each challenge, each attempt to remove it, only reinforces the irony that Bradbury so powerfully captured. What is most striking is how the novel continues to resonate. In an age of digital surveillance, algorithm-driven news, and endless entertainment, the questions Bradbury raised feel as urgent as ever. What happens when societies decide that certain ideas are too dangerous to read? What is lost when distraction replaces reflection? What becomes of memory when history itself can be rewritten? In this sense, Fahrenheit 451 is more than a story about censorship. It is a meditation on human responsibility. Bradbury reminds us that freedom of thought does not survive passively. It must be defended, not only against governments that might impose silence, but against the temptation within each of us to look away, to choose comfort over complexity. And so, despite decades of suppression, the novel endures. Its very survival, through bans, challenges, and even its own censorship, mirrors its message. Ideas like flames can spread. They can be smothered for a time, but as long as readers continue to engage, to think, and to remember, they cannot be extinguished. In the end, Fahrenheit 451 stands not just as a warning but as a testament that the written word has power, and that even when suppressed, the hunger for knowledge cannot be erased. Bradbury's fire continues to burn, not in the destruction of books, but in the determination of those who keep reading them. Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was scarred by one of the most devastating events in human history, the Black Death. Entire cities fell silent, their streets littered with grief, their communities hollowed out by fear. It was in this shadowed world that the Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio began composing the Decameron. Written between 1348 and 1353, the work is framed around 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, who flee their plague-ravaged city to a villa in the countryside. To pass the days, they tell each other stories, 100 in total, spread across 10 nights. The premise was simple but powerful. In the face of death and despair, the human spirit turns to storytelling as a way to make sense of the world, to preserve laughter, and to explore both the follies and the triumphs of life. But what made the Decameron remarkable and controversial was its content. The tales ranged from comedies to tragedies, from moral lessons to bawdy anecdotes. They depicted lust, greed, hypocrisy, clever tricks, and the sharp wit of common people outsmarting nobles, clergy, and rulers. At a time when much of medieval literature leaned heavily on piety and allegory, Boccaccio's work felt startlingly alive. His characters were not saints or distant archetypes but ordinary men and women, navigating desire, deception, and chance. The clergy were often mocked. Lovers schemed behind closed doors, and human weakness was laid bare with both humor and honesty. It is perhaps no surprise that the Church reacted uneasily to this book. Though it was celebrated for its literary brilliance, the Decameron quickly became one of the most censored works of the Renaissance. The Catholic Church, particularly during the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, condemned it for its irreverent treatment of religion and its frank depictions of sexuality. In 1559, when Pope Paul IV created the first Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of prohibited books, the Decameron was prominently included. For the Church, it was dangerous not because it questioned dogma directly, but because it normalized laughter at authority, portrayed priests and monks as fallible, and encouraged readers to see morality in shades rather than absolutes. For centuries afterward, printed editions of the Decameron were subject to heavy censorship. Passages that mocked the Church were excised, and entire stories were altered or removed. Even in relatively liberal Renaissance courts, only corrected versions could circulate. Yet these censored editions often betrayed themselves. Gaps in the text, awkward transitions, and moralizing commentary inserted by editors made it obvious that something had been erased. But censorship rarely stops curiosity. The very act of banning the book ensured that it remained desirable. Scholars, courtiers, and readers sought out manuscript copies of the unexpurgated text, passing it along in secret or preserving it in private libraries. In this way, the Decameron survived not only the Black Death, but centuries of official disapproval. Ironically, the book's candid portrayal of love and human weakness helped shape the very spirit of Renaissance literature. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, whose Canterbury Tales owes a clear debt to Boccaccio, drew inspiration from its mixture of humor, tragedy, and morality. Even as church authorities tried to silence it, the stories spread across Europe, whispered in courtly gatherings or circulated among those eager for a glimpse of life unfiltered by sermons. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Decameron once again became a lightning rod for debates about obscenity. In Victorian England, where morality was tightly policed, translations of the book were sometimes banned or circulated only in private, much like other forbidden works such as Ulysses or Lady Chatterley's Lover. What shocked medieval clerics, the laughter at monks sneaking into beds not their own, shocked Victorian censors for different reasons. The candid treatment of sexuality. Yet in modern times, the book is celebrated not as scandalous but as human. Literary critics see in it the seeds of the modern short story, while historians value it as a vivid record of 14th-century society. It captures a time when plague made life fragile, yet people still found ways to laugh, love, and tell stories. The censorship it faced reveals something enduring about the nature of suppressed books. Authorities often silence works not because they lack truth, but because they reveal too much of it. The Decameron laid bare the hypocrisies of the powerful, the desires of the ordinary, and the absurdities that thread through both. To those in authority, such honesty was dangerous. To readers, it was liberating. Today, the Decameron stands as a testament to resilience, both of human storytelling and of forbidden knowledge. The plague that inspired it has long passed, and the bands that silenced it have crumbled, but its stories still live, echoing with the laughter, sorrow, and wisdom of a world not so different from our own. In the end, Boccaccio's masterpiece was not destroyed by censorship. Instead, suppression gave it a new layer of meaning. It is no longer just a book of tales told in the shadow of the Black Death. It is also a symbol of literature's endurance, of how stories survive even when those in power try to silence them. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Decameron. In times of fear, whether from plague or censorship, stories remain. They slip past walls of authority, survive flames, and outlast even the most determined attempts to erase them. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. There are books that are suppressed because they reveal too much truth. And then, there are books that persist in history because they conceal the truth, replacing it with a dangerous illusion. Few works illustrate this more than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most notorious forgeries of modern times. The origins of the Protocols are shrouded in secrecy and deceit. Emerging in the early 20th century, the text claimed to be a record of a clandestine meeting, in which a group of Jewish leaders supposedly plotted to dominate the world. In reality, it was nothing more than a fabrication. A pastiche of plagiarized passages, conspiracy tropes, and deliberate lies. Historians have traced its creation to agents of the Russian secret police, the Okhrana, who sought to deflect rising political unrest by redirecting public anger toward a convenient scapegoat. The structure of the book was designed to be persuasive. Written in the style of secret minutes, it purported to expose strategies of manipulation, controlling the press, influencing governments, destabilizing economies. None of it was real. But the power of the Protocols lay not in truth, but in suggestion. By presenting itself as a hidden revelation, it preyed on the human fascination with forbidden knowledge. The very act of reading it felt like uncovering a secret that they did not want revealed, even though the they was itself a false construct. In 1903, excerpts of the Protocols first appeared in a Russian newspaper. Within 2 decades, the text had spread far beyond the borders of the Russian Empire. Translations appeared in multiple languages, each edition presented as proof of a global conspiracy. For regimes that thrived on division and fear, the book was a ready-made tool. It provided a narrative that explained complex social and economic upheavals in the simplest possible terms. By blaming an invented enemy, governments seized on it. In Nazi Germany, the protocols were widely circulated as part of official propaganda, reinforcing policies of exclusion and persecution. The book was even taught in schools as if it were a legitimate historical document. It served not just as a false history, but as a justification for some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Yet suppression of the book came just as swiftly. In the 1920s, investigations in Europe exposed its fraudulent origins. Journalists and scholars demonstrated that much of the text was plagiarized from an earlier political satire, Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, written in the 19th century by a French critic of authoritarianism. What had begun as an attack on autocratic government was twisted into a manual of supposed conspiracy. Courts in both Switzerland and Germany declared the text a forgery. But even when discredited, lies have a way of lingering. The protocols were too useful to those in power to be abandoned. They resurfaced in times of crisis, promoted by authoritarian states or extremist groups who needed a simple story to explain the chaos of modern life. Where there was inequality, war, or social change, the protocols offered a scapegoat. It is worth reflecting on why this book survived despite being exposed as a fabrication. Unlike the Gulag Archipelago or Fahrenheit 451, which were suppressed because they threatened those in authority, the protocols endured precisely because they served authority. Its suppression often came from courts, scholars, and free societies determined to discredit it, while its promotion came from governments and regimes seeking to divide and control. What makes the protocols so dangerous is not the words themselves, but the pattern they represent. The book is a reminder of how misinformation, when packaged as hidden knowledge, can shape entire generations. People long for explanations, especially in uncertain times, and the idea of a secret plan can feel more comforting than the truth of randomness and complexity. In this way, the protocols became a blueprint not for real conspiracy, but for the psychology of conspiracy itself. Today, over a century after its creation, the protocols is universally recognized as a forgery. And yet, echoes of it persist on the fringes of politics, whispered in online forums, recycled in new guises. Its endurance is not a testament to its authenticity, but to the human vulnerability to simple answers cloaked in secrecy. When we place the protocols of the Elders of Zion alongside other suppressed books, it occupies a strange and unsettling space. It is not a suppressed truth, but a suppressed lie, one that had to be countered again and again because of the harm it caused. Its story reminds us that censorship and suppression are not always straightforward. Sometimes, societies must work to silence falsehoods, even as others amplify them for their own ends. In the end, The Protocols is a book that stands as a warning. It shows us how easily ideas can be manufactured, how quickly they can spread, and how devastating their consequences can be when governments use them as instruments of power. It is not a work of literature or philosophy, but a weapon disguised as a manuscript. And like all dangerous weapons, it leaves behind lessons that cannot be ignored. The Protocols teaches us that knowledge must always be questioned, that truth must be defended, and that even books, which so often liberate us, can also be turned into chains. The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Among the long shelves of political thought, few books have provoked as much fear, fascination, and controversy as The Prince. Written by Niccolò Machiavelli in 1513, the work has been alternately praised as a masterpiece of realism, condemned as a manual of tyranny, and banned by governments who feared its influence. It is not a lengthy book. In fact, its compact form, written almost as a guide, is part of its power. But within those pages lies a philosophy of rule so stark and unsentimental that it still echoes 5 centuries later. Machiavelli was not a man writing from comfort or privilege. He had once served as a diplomat for the Republic of Florence, moving between courts, observing alliances, betrayals, and wars. But when the Medici family returned to power in Florence, he was dismissed, accused of conspiracy, and briefly imprisoned. Stripped of influence, he retreated to the countryside, where he wrote The Prince, a gift perhaps intended to regain favor with those in control. Instead, it became one of the most infamous works in history, The book departs sharply from the moral and religious frameworks that shaped earlier political thought. Philosophers before Machiavelli spoke of rulers as divinely guided, as guardians of justice and virtue. Machiavelli, however, looked at the world as it was, not as it ought to be. He described power as a living thing, to be grasped, defended, and wielded with precision. In his vision, morality was not irrelevant but secondary. What mattered most was stability, order, and survival. One of the book's most quoted lines captures this spirit. "It is better for a ruler to be feared than loved, if he cannot be both." For Machiavelli, human nature was fickle. Love could fade. Loyalty could break. Fear, by contrast, had weight. It endured. Yet even fear had to be measured. A prince who inspired too much cruelty risked rebellion. The art of rule was a balance between severity and restraint, a constant adjustment to circumstance. These ideas were shocking to contemporaries. To strip governance of moral pretenses, to speak openly of manipulation, deception, and violence as tools of statecraft, it felt like a betrayal of civilization itself. And so the prince became infamous, not for its elegance, but for its bluntness. The Catholic Church placed it on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1559. Monarchs viewed it with suspicion, even as they quietly consulted its strategies. For centuries, the book was read in whispers, its possession sometimes seen as evidence of dangerous thought. And yet, the paradox of the prince lies in its double life. It was condemned as immoral, but studied as indispensable. Leaders as different as Napoleon Bonaparte, Frederick the Great, and Benito Mussolini read and reflected upon it. Some treated it as scripture for conquest, others as a mirror for human weakness. The very rulers who sought to suppress its circulation often embodied its teachings in practice. The book also reshaped the language of politics itself. Before Machiavelli, politics was bound to theology. After Machiavelli, politics could be spoken of in terms of power, strategy, and human behavior alone. This shift made him a forerunner of modern political science, though one surrounded by shadows. His name even entered language as an adjective, Machiavellian, synonymous with cunning, manipulation, and ruthless pragmatism. Why, then, was it suppressed? Because the prince revealed too much. It unmasked the mechanisms of rule that leaders preferred to cloak in noble words. To admit that power was maintained through fear, deception, and force was to dismantle the myths that governments depended upon. For the Church, it was heresy. Governance without divine sanction, morality subordinated to expediency. For monarchs, it was dangerous, a guide that others might use to challenge them. And for the public, it was unsettling, the realization that politics might be less about virtue and more about survival. Yet suppression could not erase it. Copies of The Prince spread across Europe, translated into multiple languages. The very act of banning it heightened its mystique. Readers who sought forbidden knowledge found in it a text that was both brutally honest and eerily predictive. Its lessons seemed to apply again and again, across wars, revolutions, and empires. Even today, the book is debated. Some argue that Machiavelli was not endorsing cruelty, but warning rulers of the harsh realities they faced. Others see him as a satirist, exposing the corruption of power by exaggerating its logic. And still others read him as the ultimate realist, a man who refused to veil human behavior in illusions. What cannot be denied is the endurance of his vision. In times of upheaval, when institutions falter and authority is tested, the prince reemerges. It is a reminder that beneath the speeches and ideals of politics lies the raw contest for control. And while centuries of suppression sought to silence it, the book remains alive precisely because it touches a truth that societies are reluctant to acknowledge. To read The Prince is to step into a world stripped of sentiment, where the stability of the state outweighs the conscience of the ruler, where appearances matter as much as actions, and where the ends may, at times, justify the means. It is unsettling, not because it is entirely false, but because it is partly true. In the vast library of censored and suppressed works, The Prince holds a unique place. It is neither a call for freedom nor a cry for justice. It is, instead, a manual of power naked and unadorned. and perhaps that is why it has survived every attempt to bury it. For as long as there are rulers and ruled, its lessons, however controversial, will continue to resonate. Ending. And so, we come to the end of today's journey. If you found this exploration interesting, I kindly invite you to leave a like. It helps this channel grow and reach more curious minds. If you haven't already, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss the next story we share together. I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about these suppressed books? Do you believe ideas can ever truly be silenced? Share your opinion in the comments below, and let's continue the discussion together. And if you know someone who might enjoy this video, perhaps a friend who loves history or philosophy, you can share it with them too. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. I wish you good luck in all that you do, and, as always, sweet dreams.